But now it is my very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Claire Charters to provide you with an overview of the UN reporting system. Claire.
Ko tēnā koutou. Ko Ngāti Whakau e te iwi. Claire Charters is my name, and I've been working, I don't need a lectern, I've been working in Indigenous rights at the UN level for quite some time now, and I just wanted to sort of share with you to begin with my own story of engagement with the UN, really just to highlight that one, it's sort of possible to engage at those at the UN level, at that international level, and also hopefully to illustrate that it can be something that's useful. So I was quite interested at the end of my degree in Indigenous rights, and ended up doing one of my papers on what was then the draft declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples. And I remember thinking, oh, well, this is something that could be interesting to me, this is something that I feel a bit passionate about, but how on earth do I, sitting in at that point Dunedin, New Zealand, get involved and get engaged? Indigenous rights being something that I thought that was very important for us, and so how on earth do I do that? And really, this my whole engagement really came up because I wrote a letter to the person who was at the time the head of the Indigenous unit at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and said, you know, is there any possibility that I might be able to come and work with you for free for a little while? And as a result of that letter, I don't know what he responded. I got a letter and said, yeah, come along, we've got these big meetings, we need more hands on deck. And that gave me an opportunity to see the arguments that Indigenous peoples were bringing to and around Indigenous rights on the declaration, what rights that they thought should be in the declaration, and bringing their experiences from home to argue for greater rights at the international level. But really it was just that letter that was really my entree, and meant that I could meet some of the people who were the players in the area. And then subsequently then I also did an externship when I was doing my Masters in New York, so that meant that I could access again the UN. Then it became, as I became an academic, it became the area that I was interested in as well. And so as in conjunction with then working with an NGO called Aotearoa Indigenous Rights Trust here, we would go over each year and negotiate on the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was eventually then adopted in 2007 by the General Assembly, and I would then write about it in my academic writing. I also was interested when, for example, when the foreshore and seabed issue came up, about how we could use these international processes to raise human rights issues to bring to the fore, bring pressure on the government with respect to human rights issues that were raised by the Foreshore and Seabed Act. So that was the first time that led me to acting for Ngāi Tahu, especially to bring a complaint to the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination about that Foreshore and Seabed Act. And the response from the government to that particular committee report was not great in substance, in the sense that Helen Clark basically said you should throw it away. It's not of any value at all. But what was really interesting, and what I learnt about that process, was that the government was quite agitated by that, and hence that was the response. And I think it was that particular sort of opinion from an international human rights body with respect to the foreshore and seabed was instrumental. Was one of the many factors that was instrumental in sort of trying to address the problems with that act. And I don't think the current legislation is that great either, but I think it is a bit better, and I think that was one of the tools. As a result of this interaction, and a lot of this is about personal relationships, right? So you get to meet people who are active, and one of the relationships or friends that I made through this process was with the various special rapporteurs on the rights of Indigenous peoples. I'm going to explain this all in a moment, but and so as a result we could put pressure on him to come to New Zealand to review New Zealand just after the Foreshore and Seabed Act had gone through. So that was another way that we could use and bring the UN to us, and he did a report that was rather critical of the Foreshore and Seabed, also critical about, for example, the lack of enforceability of the Treaty of Waitangi, that kind of thing as well. So it was through those relationships that you could put pressure on. It wasn't just us in those relationships, but they helped. And then I ended up working with the UN, going back to the body that I'd done the volunteer work for, and worked for what's called the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So I ran that particular body for 3 years, and that is a body that tries to make these, really nice principled rights that you see in the Declaration, tries to interpret them and apply them, or advise states on how they might apply them at the domestic level. So that was really interesting. And then more recently, I was appointed a couple of years ago as a trustee for what's called the Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples. That is a fund that states support to assist Indigenous individuals to bring particular human rights issues to UN bodies. So that's been really interesting, and being involved in training of Indigenous peoples too when they come to an international fora about how you use those fora. And then most recently, as mentioned, appointed by the President of the General Assembly to assist him in this process to enhance Indigenous participation at the UN. So it all really came about because of an interest. There's no clear path as to how to engage with these bodies, but it requires a little bit of maybe something more than a letter, and obviously funding as well. But there's no clear path in, and that's I guess my point is that it's just to get engaged, and hopefully today we'll learn some ways in which you can get engaged in these processes. So I wanted to start out with, unfortunately the UN's a really complicated institution, and we're going to be talking about lots of bodies today, I assume. So I thought I might just give you, and I've just got these 2 bits of paper, I think. Thought I might just draw up the basic sort of UN structure so that you've got some idea of the bodies that we're talking about as we go through. So I'm going to put these up. Is there taken? Oh, cool. And these are quite thick, are they? Oh, I might use one of those ones. Yeah, because the UN is institutionally very complicated. I also want to say that if you've got any questions, just interrupt me. I think this is meant to be a really good informal discussion, right? So, so do interrupt me if you've got any questions as I go through. Because this will get a bit technical. I feel like you're in a university lecture just for a few minutes, but it's just really just the overview. I should say it's really nice to see. I've got some former students at law, and also to see Kingi at the back, and Chloe, for example, has been engaged in a sort of internship that we run at the University of Auckland with the Expert Mechanism. So Chloe was instrumental in helping the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples write its most recent report as well. And Kingi's been very engaged as well.
Use this one too. It's got a backing.
Oh,
the ink to go through on the wall.
Okay.
Being really practical.
Okay. I'm going to need. But you might not see this, but if I keep it up for the day, then or for the morning, then presumably you can look at it again. So basically, there's something called the UN Charter, which is the main constitutional document, I guess, it is a constitutional document essentially of the UN, and it sets up some of the main UN bodies. So some of them you might know. Now this is going to get quite small, I do know, but so it includes, for example, the General Assembly, the Security Council, what's called the International Court of Justice, which is the main court of the UN. So it includes some of those bodies, and also importantly for us, the Economic Security Council. That's right. Known for short as ECOSOC, so Economic and Social Council. So these were some of the bodies that were established by the UN back in the day in the mid-40s, 1940s. And as the UN is sort of developed and evolved, it's got all these subsidiary bodies that have been established. Now the one that's most important for us now is the Human Rights Council. Now what had happened is that originally what was called the Commission on Human Rights was under ECOSOC, and it was perceived though about 10 years ago or a bit longer that human rights was more important to be under a particular body. So a new institution was established called what we know now as the Human Rights Council. So it's not under ECOSOC anymore. I'm going to put it over here because there's going to be and it reports now directly to the General Assembly. So it's institutionally 10 years ago this year actually, it got this sort of greater status. Now underneath the Human Rights Council there is that body established what's called, which I've already mentioned, this expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples, known affectionately as UNDRIP. I don't like the acronym. I don't like DRIP either. No. I never have, so I don't use it. I refer to it as the Indigenous Declaration. So UNDRIP is a body that is made up it's just changed actually. Its mandate has just been extended. Was made up of 5 really eminent experts in Indigenous people's rights, and it was instructed each year, or worked with the Human Rights Council each year to present. They were called studies, but basically they picked up a particular right as advised by the Human Rights Council, so the right to participation in decision making, for example, and did, amongst other things, a review of how states in various different countries would look at how Indigenous peoples participate in decision making and try and provide practical advice as to how states might actually enhance Indigenous participation in decision making. So it wasn't like a complaints body, which I'll talk about, or a communications body. It wasn't a body that necessarily had this mandate to receive complaints. But what would happen is that in the fora, when it had its annual session, you would often have Indigenous peoples there advocating for it to make stronger statements. And in the process, they would be critical of states often. So they would, Indigenous people, particular groups might come up and say, look, we don't have any representation in Parliament, say, or we would prefer self-determining autonomous bodies, and we don't have that in our state, and then the states would respond. So while it's not a complaints body, it was a body that Indigenous peoples would raise issues and try and promote better norms and policies at the international level with the hope that they'll filter through to governments. Now it does have, with its mandate change, which is really recent in just September, which is a really good thing. It's now got 7 experts, will now increase to 7 experts, and there will be 1 person from the Pacific. And we've got a great person who we hope from Aotearoa who will make it onto that body, fingers and toes crossed for that. And now it really does have some role to assist states, provides technical advice to states, put pressure on states in a far more meaningful way to ensure, or the hope is to ensure that Indigenous rights are protected better. So it's got more of it's not a monitoring body as such. I'll talk about the treaty bodies in a moment, but it's got more of this role. Now so any questions about expert mechanism at this stage? If you Google it, it'll come up pretty quickly, and then you can see some pretty pictures about what it looks like in the room, and you can see all the studies that it comes up with. So under ECOSOC now, they also established a body in 2000, which started up all these acronyms. So the PFII stands for the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Now this is a body made up of 16 experts, independent experts, but they are appointed, essentially 8 of them are appointed by states essentially, and 8 are appointed essentially by Indigenous peoples with regional, global representation basically. Now this Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues its mandate looks quite limited when you read its mandate. It's about disseminating information, trying to put influence, for example, other UN agencies, so UNICEF with respect to Indigenous children, so it's trying to influence other UN agencies and disseminate information, and that's on paper that's its sort of official role. But the Permanent Forum has grown into a much larger and more significant beast in a way. This every year, and it has its session usually in April, May each year, there is up to 2,000 delegates who go to this particular meeting and lobby states with respect to particular issues that they have at home, or with respect to policy or laws or whatever. One of the really interesting things about the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, or one of its greatest values that you don't see, as I said, anywhere on paper, is that it is really the hub of the Indigenous movement at the international level. It's where you get as mentioned, hundreds of Indigenous peoples, up to 2,000, who are collaborating together on particular issues. So that's a really important component of the Permanent Forum, is really just that lobbying aspect. Also, governments are there and participating as well, so it's another place or to put pressure on government or to raise particular issues. And you know, from a Māori perspective, I've heard all sorts of issues, from the very, very local issues to sort of nationwide issues being raised in that particular forum. It's a really quite an interesting space. Well, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a person who's appointed by the Human Rights Council to do any number of things, but in the case of this Special Rapporteur, it includes doing country visits and reviewing a state's compliance with human rights, including in the case of the Special Rapporteur, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And that's the person who came out to Aotearoa Coast, Portia and Seabed and did this report. We've had 2 visits from the Special Rapporteur, firstly from Rodolfo Stavenhagen and then subsequently from James and I, the subsequent Special Rapporteur. Now they're really interesting because they come on site and they do those kind of reviews. They also do thematic studies and also can respond to particular situations that happen. So when for example, there's most recently there's been some conflict in Honduras and also in Peru with respect to Indigenous peoples defending their territories, and so the Special Rapporteur will often be sent in or invited to come in to help defuse those situations and put pressure on government to better respect Indigenous peoples' rights as well. So that's a really important role. The other thing I wanted to mention about the Human Rights Council, getting now into more sort of complaints, or how do we bring issues that are happening here on the ground in our communities up to this level, and then I'll talk about why we might want to do this. But one of the complaints or places that you can bring issues is under what's called the Universal Periodic Review, which I know people are talking about some more. So it's called the UPR. Now, the Human Rights Council is a multilateral state body. It's made up of 50, 47, something like that. I can't remember how many states seek to be on the Human Rights Council, but really all states do participate. While the council itself is made up at any given time of a number of states, all states generally participate in the Human Rights Council. They can participate. So it's a state body. So it's a bit like the wolf protecting the chickens, right? The fox protecting the chickens with respect to human rights to some extent. But what's really important about this Universal Periodic Review is it's when the Human Rights Council states review particular states over each 3 years or so. There's a cycle where every state will come up before the Human Rights Council and other states will review its human rights record. Now what's influential about this is that states do care what other states say about them. So it's a really important particular process. When it was first established, when the Human Rights Council was established, I was rather cynical of the UPR and its prospects, because I thought that there'd be a lot of horse trading between states, where we won't say something bad about you if you don't say something bad about us. But I've been pleasantly surprised about how effective it is. Now, I've had one experience of lobbying with respect to the UPR, and that was in New Zealand's first report, which I think was 2009, was it? Something like that. And what was really interesting was that we, as an organisation, Aotearoa Indigenous Rights Trust, had particular things we wanted other states to know about Aotearoa so that they could incorporate it into this review of Aotearoa New Zealand. And that was surprisingly easy. It was about preparing some good documentation, some simple documentation, preparing some questions that they could ask, that other states could ask of Aotearoa. And I was in the room at the time, so I literally went round and handed it out, said, hello, my name's Claire Charters, I'm from Aotearoa, these are some issues. And those questions would just kept coming, these from this particular sheet. And what's interesting is that it's a high-level New Zealand delegation, in New Zealand's case, that goes over and sits at the front of the podium as part of this review process. So you've got ministers and also high-level officials. So it's quite effective in terms of raising issues and getting responses. It's coming through the voice of states, but it's quite easy to get involved. There are also places and ways in which you can make written contributions from Aotearoa New Zealand. You don't have to be there, although it does help. I'm sure there'll be more detail about how you engage with that from a practical level. And that is something that New Zealand now has to go back to. It receives recommendations from the Human Rights Council, from the UNDRIP working group, and has to constantly respond to and say whether it accepts the recommendation or what it's doing with respect to these recommendations. So it's there is some impact, and it's quite easy to engage with it. So there are various different treaties, human rights treaties. There are more, but those are some of the most relevant for our purposes. So there are various different treaties that come up through the UN processes. So they've been signed off by the UN, and then states ratify them if they accept the rights in them. But they stand separate institutionally from these charter bodies. So, as you might expect, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights deals mainly with civil and political rights. In its Article 27, it's got an important right for us, and that's the right to culture. So that's an important one there. Economic, social and cultural rights deals with, as you might expect, economic, social and cultural rights. Really important one is Article 15, which is the right to culture. And obviously the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, often referred to as CERD, deals with obviously racial discrimination. Now what's really interesting with these treaties is that they established committees that work to basically seek the implementation of those treaties. So this moves me on to, well, why would you engage in this? Okay, so you can access these places potentially, and you'll hear more about how you do that. But why? Why would you do that? To what end? And it's a really hard question. And obviously, this is one that I face a lot with students. I mean, from a really broad level, the United Nations is about world peace. It's about getting states together to cooperate so that we don't end up in intractable, terrible wars. And that's really at its heart. That was how the UN came about. And that might seem like a lofty goal, and how do you do that? How does that relate to us? But there's a very clear recognition that states' respect for human rights is part of that. It's a necessary component of that broader objective, or something that you have to do in order to achieve this broader objective. So with that lofty goal, this participation, I think, in human rights is supporting that goal, engaging with that broader goal. Coming to more practically, so if you've got some calls from any of these bodies on Aotearoa saying, you're not doing that so well, or that perhaps you could do that better, or this is the international standard, you're not meeting it. The pressure that puts on the government is mainly political. It's not strictly legal. And one of the important components, I think, of using that as a tool, as a tool to influence the government, is to engage media when you're doing this kind of activity. It's not just ensuring that New Zealand knows that there is a particular human rights abuse and is putting that pressure or trying to influence government to change it, but using media in a broader sense. It's really a political game that you're playing. But that's not to say that these bodies don't have, and these instruments don't have, some form of legal impact. So the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Indigenous Declaration, which was negotiated over more than 20 years, ended up being adopted by the Human Rights Council and then adopted by the General Assembly. Now that is a really interesting instrument, and I presume you'll be discussing more about that particular instrument. Parliament today. But that has got some legal force, I think. I at least argue in my own work. And you see that, for example, in a number of Supreme Court of New Zealand decisions. So increasingly, Māori claimants are arguing their case using the Declaration as a support. So there are a number of really important Supreme Court decisions that refer to the Declaration. I wouldn't say it's decisive in determining outcomes in particular cases, but it's certainly influential. So for example, in one case not so long ago, the courts said that you could use it to help you interpret what the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi are. That's the case involving treaty principles. And that's really important because the Declaration is a lot more explicit and express in setting out rights for Indigenous peoples, including the right to self-determination, including strong rights to lands, territories and resources, including strong rights to culture and non-discrimination, equality rights. So to the extent that they're using to help them understand how to apply and think about what rights are included in the treaty, the Declaration has had some influence. You also see it very used significantly and increasingly so by the Waitangi Tribunal. So in one report a couple of years ago, it literally put up what is the principle of the treaty and put next to it, well, this covers these rights in the Declaration, and so we're going to look to governmental action and assess it against the Declaration in our interpretation of the government's compliance with the Treaty of Waitangi principles. So that's been a really interesting development. You also see it politically, the Declaration come up, and everyone, you know, 4R8 to go through all the parliamentary records to see where the Declaration is mentioned in Parliament. And it comes up quite a lot, particularly around any issue that involves Māori. So politicians are using it as a reference point. You see the Declaration being used, as mentioned by the Special Rapporteur, the expert mechanism, the permanent forum, and these bodies are using it also to help them interpret human rights. So the government, what is a fairly constant state of review by treaty bodies, the UPR processes, also potentially the Special Rapporteur, these bodies are looking at Aotearoa with respect to these human rights and incorporating the Declaration as part of that assessment. Saying the Declaration is important to how we understand, for example, the right to culture. Now, the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, I mention this because New Zealand is coming up for review with the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, has come out with a very important sort of statement or interpretation of the right to culture that includes this what's called the right of Indigenous peoples to free, prior, informed consent. That when something particularly impacts on Indigenous peoples and Māori in our case, that the state needs to acquire Indigenous peoples' free, prior, informed consent. Now, that's really important for us because there are so many activities that go on, particularly I'm thinking about oil and gas, that kind of thing, where you might argue that Indigenous peoples and Māori consent is required. So that might be something that comes up, I hope it does, before the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Committee. Just one other thing to note too is that as well as all the written documentation that you can do when you're communicating with these bodies, like New Zealand's coming up for review and you might submit sort of shadow reports they're called. You might say, well, this is we think there's this human rights problem in Aotearoa. You can also present your submissions basically to these committees. And you don't have to go to Geneva or New York to do it. So recently with the Human Rights Committee, it was a colleague and a friend of mine and I got up at 1 o'clock in the morning and had a Skype call with all the committee members to raise particular issues that we see. So the kind of issues that I focus on generally is lack of enforceability of the treaty, these broader constitutional issues, that kind of thing. So if you're willing to get up at 1 o'clock in the morning, you can get an audience. And that's not hard to organise. It's really just an email to the person in the Secretariat to say, look, we'd like to talk to the committee members. We can't make it over to Geneva. And we had an hour with them during their lunch break. So it's not as far away or as inaccessible as you might think on a very practical basis. But I know, as I mentioned, that others are going to talk about that. Again, apologies for all the acronyms. It's a bit ridiculous, but I don't have room to write them all up. What else was I going to mention? Maybe I'll just briefly mention the two sort of appointments that I had because they're relevant to what's going on. So in 2014 there was a world conference on Indigenous peoples. Now this was a high-level meeting of the General Assembly, so you got sort of ministers, prime ministers, presidents, that kind of thing, coming to work out at the international level what sort of policies and objectives the international community should have with respect to Indigenous peoples. And one of the things that this World Conference agreed upon is that there should be greater or more avenues for Indigenous peoples to access United Nations as Indigenous peoples. Because when you go to, for example, the Human Rights Council, to get in the door and to be able to present there, you have to be what's called an accredited non-governmental organisation. And many Indigenous peoples, sovereign nations, say, well, we're not a non-governmental organisation. In fact, we're quite the contrary. We're governing institutions. And we need to be at these places, not as part of civil society generally, but as self-determining sovereign bodies. And so this World Conference accepted that to some extent and set in motion this process for the General Assembly to be able to accommodate Indigenous peoples participating as Indigenous peoples, and also, importantly, opening the door to consider participation in the General Assembly. Now that might not sound like much. Some NGOs can get in the door sometimes, but usually not. It's this very, and it's an intergovernmental body. There are some like the European Union has a space that it can go and contribute to the General Assembly deliberations. But really to open up to Indigenous peoples is going a little bit along the lines of recognising that Indigenous peoples have equality. Maybe they're not states, but they're certainly governing sovereign type bodies. And no other group has that sort of access. So it's a pretty big thing for the UN generally to potentially be opening the doors a bit to the General Assembly. And it's pretty big that it's also Indigenous peoples. It's at its heart, it's some recognition of this, that Indigenous peoples are unique and have this particular governance kind of claim or stake. And so what's happening now in the General Assembly is that we're just starting, we've had basically 6 months of what we call consultations. So you've had all the states that have come together and say, we think this is what Indigenous participation should look like at the UN. And we're going to really start the informal negotiations in a couple of weeks, on 14th, 15th of December. We're there, and I'll be advising the President of the General Assembly with 3 others, so 2 ambassadors and Professor James Anaya from the States. Be sort of supervising, I guess, in some ways, that negotiation process. Supervising is the wrong word, but sort of facilitating that negotiation process, which will hopefully lead to a resolution with some form of enhanced Indigenous participation at the UN, so that Indigenous can participate as Indigenous peoples, not as NGOs, and also have greater participation. So that's something that's happening at the moment. I mentioned the expansion of the mandate of the expert mechanism. That's a really big thing. And it'll be fascinating to see how that plays out. As I said, it's not a monitoring mechanism as such, not in the same way that these treaty bodies are, but it's really going to be able to get into problems and issues on the ground. So finally, the Voluntary Fund for Indigenous people. So that is a fund, as mentioned, that states contribute to. New Zealand hasn't contributed for a long time, so some pressure on there. That Indigenous peoples, individuals can apply to bring communications to all these treaty bodies, to participate in the permanent forum, to participate in the UPR process, and to participate in the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples. The Voluntary Fund was established in the 80s. It's funded over 2,000 Indigenous individuals over its time. We fund about 30 to the permanent forum this year, and on an ad hoc basis with the civil to treaty bodies as and when people apply for funding. very much a priority for the fund, for us to support Indigenous peoples who want to bring their communications to and go to Geneva and raise their issues with these particular treaty bodies, equally with the UPR. So that is an avenue to think about if you want to raise a particular issue there.